To begin with, often, the teachings that we give or receive as Tibetan Buddhist students are talking about compassion, and it depends. In the Tibetan Buddhist context particularly, we would be speaking of compassion in the context of bodhicitta, or as a method for developing bodhicitta. So not merely as a feeling of like, oh, that's too bad, or I feel pity, or something like that, but a genuine wish to free beings from suffering, and not just temporary, immediate sense of suffering, but to bring them to the state of enlightenment, which would mean to completely eliminate even the causes of their suffering. And not only that, but bring them to a state where they can bring the maximum benefit to the world. And so compassion is talked about in that sense as not exactly an end in and of itself, but in another context, it is the natural expression of the enlightened mind as well. But as an unenlightened person, it's something we have to develop more step by step, or more intentionally through some methods of practice. So, for example, by imagining maybe first someone who you feel very close to, and imagining their suffering and developing a really powerful wish to free them from that suffering, and meditating in that way, and then developing that until that becomes a powerful, like, real lived experience, and then expanding that out to others, to maybe people who are in your whole network of friends and family, co-workers, and so forth, then even more outwards to your entire city, state, country, the entire world, countless worlds, and so forth. So we have a practice of the four immeasurables, or the four boundless thoughts, which is a way of developing that in a way, out to infinite beings. And so, whereas, in just the teachings on compassion alone, the emphasis is more on developing that attitude. And then if you have that attitude, hopefully that starts reflecting in your action. However, when we start talking about bodhicitta, meaning kind of the more fuller expression of compassion, compassion alone, it does not define bodhicitta. There has to be the wish for the full enlightenment of all beings. That's the additional factor that distinguishes bodhicitta from mere compassion. And in that context, then, along with this aspirational bodhicitta, which is that wish to free beings from suffering and bring them to enlightenment, there are these aspects of engagement of the six perfections, as I mentioned before. And those could start to become reflected in various ways, because also they could start on a very small level, like the aspect of generosity. In some texts, they talk about, I forget if this is from a sutra or what, but it's talked about that, there was, I think it was a king in ancient India who was so miserly that he couldn't even give anything to anyone. And the Buddha taught him to start just handing things from one hand to the other and imagining he was giving it to someone. And so, like, it can be as simple as, or as low level you might think of as a simple gift of handing something from one hand to the other, building up to giving someone some food, a morsel of food, building up to, not only giving some material things, but giving protection from fear, giving the Dharma. There are different ways that generosity is talked about, the generosity of giving material things, the generosity of giving protection from fear, generosity of giving the gift of the Dharma, protection from fear also, that it depends upon the individual's way of engaging with that teaching. Some people will feel like giving protection from fear is just, you see a snail or a worm on the road and you put it back into some moist dirt or something like that. For other people, that could mean fully expressing that in terms of protesting against certain wars, or protecting beings who are unhoused, or that could express itself in many ways, and those are not as explicitly talked about in the tradition as, like, you should do this or that. Like, you should go in your community and feed people. You should go in your community and protest against war, or any kind of atrocities in the world, or something like that. So it's more to the individual in terms of how they might express those teachings on generosity, for example. That's just one example of the six perfections, these different aspects of traditional, frameworks of practice. But it would be like maybe up to the individual about how they would express that. In terms of interdependence, to come around to that, there are more and more discussions about the principle of interdependence in the greater worldview. I think it's even just common knowledge, like people, the butterfly effect and all these kind of things. People talk about that in pop culture. but also a lot of teachers like Tulkusang Rinpoche often talks about the idea of collective karma. Thinking of that from the perspective that if all of us are contributing to a really consumer society and not really checking our own sense of contentment and having enough, like what's enough, and all of us as a collective effort continuing to feed into this like it's never enough kind of consumer society is destroying the world and destroying the environment. So rather than explicitly saying things like you shouldn't do this or that, or you should buy organic things and you should buy less things or whatever, people like Tulkusang Rinpoche will just point to the kind of the reality of what we're doing and what is happening in that. And like he, just as a character, is a Lama who's less likely to explicitly say you don't do this or don't do that. He'll maybe point to our reality that certain things we're doing is creating, and leave it to you to like maybe interpret and then make some changes in your own life about how you might try to do something more positive or express that in your own way. Joshua, you wanna? Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Justin. I'm gonna build on Justin in a different way. I want to speak more towards how Tibetan Buddhist practices, and really just Buddhist practice generally, support my actions in the world and how I see it supporting others. So, again, I'll start just with the personal narrative of I found Namchak at a time when I was burning out as a young activist. I had been working hard for years, like trying to run a nonprofit, just in the hustle of trying to keep a nonprofit alive. And I was working hard with so many of my peers just to create change. And in all my youthful idealism, just really wanting change to happen a lot faster than change often does. I mean, sometimes it is swift. We all have seen incredible moments of fast change, but change is also often slow. But I came to Tibetan Buddhist practice really as a burning out activist. I wasn't burnt out yet, but I was burning out. And I wasn't, even though I was rooted in my spirituality, I really wasn't engaging in enough daily practice. And so for me, Buddhist practice, one, it just helped me rest and recover my energies. And hopefully we all have a taste of that when we're, in our practice groove. And it just helps our overall balance and well-being, right? And our kind of mental at easeness, right, with being alive in this world. I think as I got deeper into the Tibetan Buddhist teachings and practices, I also just discovered more levity and lightheartedness, right? Again, as someone who's awake to so much suffering on this planet, who has experienced it, but witnesses it everywhere I look, it's heartbreaking, and it creates grief and heaviness, when we hold the pain of the world so tight and so close. And as I began to experience more personal freedom, right, through my Buddhist practice, I still felt a lot of passion, about creating change in the world, but I found a lot more openness, in the way I went about it, and a lot more openness and how I thought about outcomes, right, and how change unfolds. So for me, Tibetan Buddhist practice, it fills me with compassion and also wisdom, right, from the Buddhist teachings of interdependence, and even understanding that truly the emptiness of it all as well, and the impermanence of it all, that freedom gives me so much more spaciousness around how I act in the world. And then just one practical one that I hope some of you have experienced this, but just a recent story. So Don Glenn is phenomenal at building, our compassion muscles. And I was recently spending time with family, but what I noticed, just in this recent week being with family is I was able to maintain my love and connection with these family members. I was able to listen and hear their viewpoints. I was able to slow not only myself down, but I was able to slow our shared conversations down if ever they would start to escalate. We all know how that it can happen quick. Those trigger points come. Um, and yeah, there was just something beautiful possible in our conversation that never would have been possible in my life before. So I just, felt called to share that practical example of the benefits of Tibetan Buddhist practice in my own life.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing, Joshua. And I just wanted to check in before we move on to our next question. Justin, anything that sparked for you, and we'll continue to.
Yeah, this is like maybe touching on the theory behind what Joshua is saying, but it is talked about, in traditional texts, even on the six perfections that, even in the ceremony for taking the bodhisattva vow, one of them is that I will follow in the footsteps of the other bodhisattvas, but it says step by step, gradually. So it doesn't mean dive in head first, forget about my own capacities or my own boundaries and forget, dive straight into a situation that I'm not able to deal with, but to take it where you are. And as you do more practice, that builds that capacity, like Joshua was saying, to be able to experience maybe a bit more peace, a bit more tranquility, a bit more insight that allows you to have a greater capacity in the type of engaged actions, whatever that might express itself for the individual in terms of how they're expressing their engagement in the world. So, yeah.